Ruth Halvorsen was 52 years old on the morning the bank changed the locks on her front door, and she stood on the step of a house she'd lived in for 19 years, with 2 canvas bags and a wicker sewing basket and $223 in her checking account, and no clear idea of where to go next. Not a plan she'd been working on quietly. Not a relative she could call without the conversation, turning into something she didn't have the energy for. Just a 2003 Subaru Outback, with 218,000 kilometers on it, and her grandmother's sewing basket on the passenger seat, because she couldn't bring herself to put it in the trunk with everything else. 3 weeks later, at a county tax auction in Renfrew County, Ontario, she submitted the only bid on a property that made the auctioneer glance at the card twice before he called it. A derelict dry goods and notions shop in a hamlet called Linden Crossing, population 17, sitting at the end of a gravel road in a cedar valley no one outside the county had reason to know existed. Closed since 2008, the porch boards had gone soft, the shingles were going black at the eaves, and in the back room, beneath a loose pine floorboard that no one had lifted in 15 years, inside a cedar chest that no one in that valley knew was there, was something that would not only put Ruth back on her feet, it would reach back 40 years and show her and everyone in that quiet place what it means to love a community so completely that you leave a piece of yourself inside it, long after you're gone. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, go ahead and hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. These stories travel farther than we ever expect. Ruth was born in Sudbury, Ontario, the second of 3 daughters, in a house where the winters arrived early and stayed without apology. Her mother worked the school lunch line. Her father drove transport up and down the highway between Sudbury and North Bay, home on weekends and tired the rest of the time. The thing that saved Ruth from the particular loneliness of that kind of childhood was her grandmother, a woman named Elsa Halvorsen, who lived on the edge of town and kept 3 sewing machines running at once. Elsa was a Finnish-Canadian woman with opinions about thread tension the way other people had opinions about politics, firmly held and extensively explained. Every Saturday, Ruth sat at the corner of her grandmother's cutting table and watched her work. The way she'd hold a piece of fabric up to the light, and read it the way another person might read a face. Elsa taught her to cut on the bias, to press a seam before sewing the next one, to hand-stitch a hem so small it was nearly invisible. She did not teach with compliments. She taught by handing Ruth the scissors and letting her feel what she'd done wrong. The summer Ruth turned 14, Elsa pressed a silver thimble into her palm. It was old, worn almost flat on the cap from decades of use, with the initials EH stamped into the side. "You'll use this more than you think," Elsa said, that was all. Ruth had kept it in a velvet pouch in the sewing basket every day since. The way some people carry a rosary, the way some people carry nothing at all but need to. The life Ruth built as a grown woman looked solid enough from the outside. She married Keith Lundgren when she was 29. They settled in Pembroke. Keith worked in commercial insurance. Ruth ran a small alterations business from the spare bedroom. Custom work, wedding dresses. The kind of careful labor that doesn't make anyone rich but keeps the hands honest. The years moved the way years do when you are not unhappy. Keith died of a heart attack on a Tuesday in February in the driveway before he made it to the car. He was 55. Ruth had 11 minutes of warning, just the sound he made on the stairs. A sound she'd never heard before and knew immediately was wrong. And then the ambulance, and the hospital, and a room full of people telling her things she had no capacity yet to receive. And then, 3 months later, the other thing. Going through the filing cabinet in the basement, a cabinet she'd had no reason to open during their marriage, she found the second mortgage, the line of credit. A credit card she hadn't known existed. Carrying a balance that made her sit down on the concrete floor with the paper in her hand and stay there a long time. She never found a clear explanation for why Keith had done it. What she found instead were the consequences: a house worth less than what was owed, a savings account drained quietly for years to cover minimum payments, and a bank that was professional and patient, and, ultimately, unmovable. She had 14 months between the funeral and the locksmith's visit. She used them trying everything she could think of. She worked her alterations, took on extra jobs, sat across from 3 different advisors. None of it added up to enough. The house went in September. On the morning the locks changed, Ruth put her bags in the Subaru, set her grandmother's basket on the passenger seat, and looked at the house for a long time from the driver's seat. Then she drove to a Tim Hortons on the highway and sat in the parking lot with a medium coffee until it went cold. She did not cry. She had been doing that in private for 14 months. She was tired of it. She had $223. She had no plan. She had the sewing basket and the thimble inside it, and she drove. It was a Thursday afternoon in mid-October when Ruth found herself in the branch library in Arnprior, using the free internet and searching without much direction through rural Ontario property listings. She was not looking for anything specific. She was looking the way you look at the back of a drawer when you can't name what you need, but you know it has to be somewhere. 2 pages of listings, bush lots, abandoned farms, a church in a village she'd never heard of, and then she stopped. Renfrew County tax sale auction, at the bottom of the list, said in plain type. 1-story commercial building, 4 and 12 square feet with attached storage. Former use, dry goods and notions retail. Located at Linden Crossing Road, Linden Crossing, Ontario. Bid population, 17. Minimum bid, 35 Zeus. Property sold as is. Buyer assumes all responsibility for outstanding structural or environmental compliance requirements. A notions shop. Ruth sat with that for a long time. She thought about Elsa. She thought about the cutting table, the smell of cedar and cotton and sizing. She thought about what her grandmother used to say when someone brought in fabric too far gone to work with. You don't throw it out, you find out what it still wants to be. She didn't know whether an abandoned notions shop in a hamlet of 17 people could become anything at all. But for the first time in 14 months, something had made her lean toward the screen instead of away from it. She went to the auction 3 days later with the last of what she had. She bid $35. No one else raised a hand. Linden Crossing sits in a valley about 40 minutes west of Renfrew. Cedar rail fences along gravel roads, poplar stands gone yellow in October, a creek you hear before you see it. Ruth turned in from the county road. In the late afternoon, the sky the particular gray of an Ottawa Valley autumn that can't decide between the seasons. 4 buildings. A stop sign, a grain barn with a collapsed hip, a house with chimney smoke, a small board church with the windows boarded tight, and at the bend in the road, set back on a lot gone entirely to goldenrod and burdock, the shop. Ruth parked and got out and stood in the long grass and looked. It was smaller than she'd pictured and better built. Board and batten walls, painted dark green once, now weathered to a soft gray. A covered porch running the width of the front. Boards sagging in the middle but posts standing straight. And above the door, in lettering so faded she had to walk through the goldenrod and up the porch steps to read it, a sign painted by hand in careful strokes. Every stitch holds someone together. Ruth stood on the porch and read it 3 times. She did not know who had put it there. She did not know why a dry goods shop at the end of a gravel road would carry a line like that. But she felt, in some way that made no rational sense and that she couldn't have explained to anyone, that the line had been waiting for the right set of eyes. If you're still with us, go ahead and hit subscribe. Because what Ruth found inside that shop is something the valley itself had long forgotten was there. The county property office was in Renfrew, 40 minutes back toward town. The woman at the counter was Helen McKay, mid-60s, reading glasses on a chain, the unhurried manner of someone who has sat in the same chair for 30 years and intends to sit there 10 more. She took the auction paperwork, looked at it, looked at Ruth, set it down slowly. Thorne's, she said, it wasn't a question. She explained. Edna Thorne, who had run the shop for 40 years, had died in 2008 with no children, no spouse, and a niece in British Columbia who had not answered a single certified letter the county sent her across 6 years of back taxes. The redemption period expired in the spring. 3 auction seasons had passed with no bids. People were put off by the compliance requirements. The structural unknowns, the old electrical, the cost of bringing it up to standard. Helen looked at Ruth with the steady attention of someone who has learned to read a situation quickly and accurately. You understand it wants significant work. I understand, Ruth said. And you've driven here from Pembroke. Sudbury, originally. Helen studied her for a moment more. Then she did a thing Ruth would not forget. She reached into her desk drawer and set a key ring on the counter. 2 old brass keys, the kind nobody cuts anymore, tied with a card that said Thorne's Notions, Linden Crossing in handwriting gone faint with age. These have been sitting in that drawer since the file came in. I thought someone ought to have them. Ruth paid the transfer fee, $38, counted out from her last bills and coins. When Helen slid the deed across the counter, she said, "The valley is small. People will notice you're there. Give it time." On the drive back to Linden Crossing, Ruth counted what remained. 67, 2 keys, a sewing basket, a shop. She slept in the Subaru that first night, parked in the lot where she could see the porch. She lay in the reclined seat, with the basket on the floor beside her, and listened to the creak and the wind in the poplars. She was not unafraid. She had been afraid, more or less continuously, since February. But the particular fear she'd been living with, the low, directionless one that comes from having no aim at all, had gone quiet for the first time. She was pointed at something that was new. She opened the shop the next morning. The front room smelled of cedar and something dry and sweet she couldn't name. Old cotton, she thought, or the particular smell of work done in a small space for a long time. Shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, coated in 15 years of dust, but there, bolts of fabric, some too far gone but some still sound, jars of buttons, thread on faded spools, a cardboard display of zippers still sealed in their original wrappers, a wooden box of needles, 3 glass apothecary jars that had held ribbon. Behind the counter, a treadle sewing machine in a wooden cabinet, and beside it, a wooden stool with a worn cushion tied to the seat. Ruth spent 3 days just cleaning. She swept 15 years of dust from the plank floor. She wiped every shelf. She pumped water from the hand pump behind the building, which groaned and spat rust, and then cleared to cold and clean. Every evening back to the Subaru, every morning back in. On the 4th day, she found the cedar chest. It was in the back storage room, under a section of flooring that made a slightly different sound when she crossed it, not hollow exactly, but different. She worked a pry bar under the plank. It lifted cleanly as though the nails had been eased at some point on purpose. Beneath it, fitted into the space between the floor joists, was a cedar chest about the size of a blanket box. The cedar smell rose up like something that had been waiting for air. She got it out and set it on the back workbench. Brass latch, green with age, she pressed it. The lid opened. The first item was a length of deep crimson wool, folded with extraordinary care, wrapped in waxed paper, and tied with a faded ribbon. Wool like that would have cost real money when it was bought, and it was still perfectly sound. The second was a bundle in kitchen string, a stack of old Canadian savings bonds, a roll of bills bound with a rubber band so old it had partially fused to the paper. She set it aside without counting it. The third was a ledger, black cloth cover worn at the corners. She opened it. The first half was the ordinary record of a small business. Dates, names, invoices. The careful handwriting of a woman who tracked everything. Thorne's Notions, January 1968. The pages ran through decades, through all the quiet vocabulary of a working fabric shop. Thread and buttons and bias tape and interfacing. The steady history of a place and its work. But in the back half of the ledger, the pages changed. No more inventory, names, a date, a description, a dollar amount, and next to each amount, instead of any mark for paid or outstanding, a single word, written in the same even hand, repeated across page after page across 36 years. Given. Ruth sat down on the wooden stool and read. Henderson girls, 3 confirmation dresses, white lawn and lace, $24 given. Their father has been laid off since March. Mrs. Corhan wool for winter coats, 2 children's sizes, $17.50 given. Widow, gets by on what the church puts together. Stan Birch, coat lining, heavy twill enough for a full coat, $9 given. Left it on the counter and told him a customer had returned it. He's too proud to accept a gift directly. Young woman from the LaRose farm, muslin for a wedding dress, 3 yards given. She wept when I told her it was covered. I looked away so she wouldn't be embarrassed. The list went on, page after page, from 1971 to 2007. Hundreds of names, hundreds of times the word given written next to what someone had needed and been quietly handed. Some entries were just a name, a number, the word. Others had a line or two after, and it was those lines that made Ruth's throat close. Old Mr. Prevost, suit lining enough to reline his church jacket, given he told me it was the last suit he'd ever need. I didn't argue with him about that. Nola Caju, red cotton with white dots, enough for a child's dress, first day of school given. I saw that little girl walk into the schoolyard from the road. She had her head up. Ruth sat on the stool in the back room of a shop she had owned for 4 days. and she read 36 years of one woman's quiet insistence that the people around her would be clothed and warm, and held together, even when they couldn't pay for it. Even when they didn't know she was the one holding them. She read it the way you read something when you need to be certain it's real. Line by line, slowly. At the bottom of the chest was an envelope, on the front in the same even hand, for whoever opens this next. Ruth opened it carefully. Inside a letter 3 pages front and back dated March 2007, a year before the shop closed. She read it there, on the stool, in the light coming through the back window. To whoever is reading this. I am 81 years old, and my hands are not what they were. I have known for some time that I cannot keep the shop open much longer, and I have no one to leave it to in the ordinary way. My niece in Victoria is a good woman, but this valley is not her life, and I have made my peace with that. The shop was my mother's before it was mine. She opened it in 1952 with the money she'd saved working the war years in a textile mill in Carlton Place. She believed, and I have believed my whole life, that fabric is not an ordinary thing to sell. It is what we wrap around people when they are cold. It is what we make their wedding dresses from. It is what goes into the arms of a child on the first day of school, and into the lining of the last coat a man will ever wear. I could never charge full price for that. Some of them I couldn't charge anything at all. The ledger is the record of what I gave away. I do not regret a single entry. The money in this chest, the bonds, the cash, is everything I managed to set aside for myself over 40 years. It is not much. But it is real, and it is yours now, and I leave it here with the shop. I ask only one thing, not a legal condition, the request of an old woman who has loved this place for a very long time. Keep the needle threaded for the one who can't thread it themselves. There is always someone who can't thread it themselves. Edna Thorne, March 2007. Ruth folded the letter back along its creases. She sat for a long time in the back room of the shop with one hand on the ledger, and one hand around her grandmother's thimble in its velvet pouch. The creak ran outside. The cedar chest sat open on the workbench, smelling of 40 years. 2 women she had never met, who had never met each other, had believed the same thing about the same work. She didn't know yet what she was going to do, step by step. But she knew with a clarity she hadn't felt in over a year that she was exactly the right person to be sitting in that chair. If this story is finding you tonight, share it with someone who needs it, and stay with us, because just when Ruth thought the worst was behind her, a car with out-of-province plates was about to turn onto Linden Crossing Road. The first person from the valley came on a Saturday. Ruth was on the porch pulling a rotten board loose when she heard gravel and looked up. An older woman in a brown wool coat stepped out of a Buick LeSabre and stood at the edge of the lot, looking at the shop for a long moment before walking up through the goldenrod. Her name was Bet Arsenault. She had lived 3 kilometers down the valley road for 47 years. She looked at the new porch board Ruth had already replaced. She looked at the sign above the door. She said, "My mother's name is in that ledger, isn't it?" It was not a question. What was her name? Ruth asked. Korhonen. She came here every winter for 20 years. Mrs. Korhonen. Wool for winter coats, 2 children's sizes, given widow. Yes, Ruth said, she's there. Bet was quiet for a moment then. My mother thought she was paying full price. She brought it up near the end of her life. Said she never understood how Edna could sell wool so cheap. I always suspected. She looked at Ruth steadily. You going to stay? I'm going to try. Bet nodded. I'll come Tuesday with a casserole and my husband Frank. He's done roofing his whole life. Those eaves won't survive another winter the way they are. She came back Tuesday, and after that most Tuesdays. Frank Durrett was a retired contractor with the careful hands and patient manner of a man who has fixed things in hard country for 40 years. He walked the building the way a doctor walks a patient, pressing the soft spots, checking the foundation sills, looking up at the rafters. Then he took off his cap, scratched his head and said, "Bones are good. It's been neglected, not abused. There's a difference." He agreed to come on weekends. He taught Ruth to replace damaged siding, to read how ice and meltwater move around an old building over a long Ontario winter, to clear a blocked soffit before the snow backed up and rotted the eaves from inside. He had the manner of someone who learned the trade from someone else, and passed it the same way. By showing, not explaining. By putting the tool in the other person's hand. One afternoon in late October, resting against the south wall in a thin patch of sun. Frank told Ruth that his mother had come to this shop in 1979 when the family was short, and Edna Thorne had quietly handed over fabric for a winter coat and accepted a fraction of the price and said nothing about the rest. She never told anyone what she did, Frank said. She just did it. Ruth told him about the ledger, the word given written next to each name. Frank sat with that for a moment. That's more than most people leave behind, he said. Ruth painted the sign. She climbed a stepladder with a brush and a tin of dark green paint and traced each letter carefully, following the ghost of strokes already there. Every stitch holds someone together. When she came down, Bet was standing in the lot with 2 mugs of coffee, looking up at the freshly painted letters against the gray wood. She didn't say anything for a while, then, there it is. The black SUV came on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after Ruth had put a hand-lettered sign on the road. Alterations and repairs. Bring what you have. 2 men got out. The younger one wore a jacket too light for the season and had the manner of someone perpetually calculating the next item on an agenda. The older one carried a leather portfolio and walked the lot with the eyes of a man pricing every square meter. "You the one who bought this?" the younger one said, skipping the greeting. "I am. I'm Kyle Thorne. Edna Thorne was my great-aunt. This property should have gone to family." He nodded at the man with the portfolio. "This is Derek Voss, representing a development group that's been looking at this corridor. We're here to address a problem in the title transfer." Voss opened the portfolio and set papers on the hood of the SUV. "Mrs. Halvorsen, the county failed to properly locate and notify a living heir before proceeding to auction. That makes the transfer potentially voidable. We can take that to court, which takes considerable time and money on your part, or you can accept a settlement. $3,000 you vacate in 30 days. That's $3,000 for a property you paid $35,000 for." Ruth looked at the 2 men carefully. She looked at Kyle Thorne, who shared his great-aunt's name and had not, as far as she could determine, ever once come to this place while Edna was alive, or after. She did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago, at the cutting table from Elsa, from the kind of discipline that careful work requires, that forcing something never makes it come out right. "I'll consider what you've said," she told them, "but before you file anything, there's something you should know." Edna left a letter. She addressed it to whoever came after her. "I think you might want to know what's in it." She didn't show them the letter. She only said it existed. Something shifted in Kyle Thorne's expression, a tightening around the eyes, brief and quickly controlled. Voss snapped the portfolio shut. 2 weeks, Voss said, then we file." They drove away, and the gravel dust settled on the November road, and Ruth went inside and called a lawyer. Her name was Ingrid Salo, early 50s, rural property law out of Renfrew, with the calm of someone who has heard this particular conversation before. She didn't sound alarmed over the phone. "Stay where you are," she said. "I'll pull the file." What Ingrid found in the county records and the provincial land registry took less than a week. 3 certified letters had been sent to Kyle Thorne's address in Surrey, British Columbia over 6 years, notifying him of the tax arrears, the pending forfeiture, the upcoming auction. The first 2 had been refused at the door. The return card on the 3rd carried his signature. The statutory redemption period, 3 years from the date of forfeiture, had expired in the spring, months before Ruth had ever heard of this valley. "Your title is clean," Ingrid told Ruth, the file spread across the desk between them. He was notified. He chose not to respond because the property had no value to him then. "That's not a legal problem for you. That's a personal one for him." She paused, and then said the other thing. "I also looked into the building compliance issues, the ones that made everyone walk away." She turned a page. "The province has a Heritage Properties Fund, rural commercial buildings pre-1960, low population municipalities. The structural work you need to pass inspection? Most of it is covered if you file the application correctly." Ruth looked at her. Why didn't anyone know about that? Ingrid gave the small, dry smile of someone who has practiced rural property law for a long time. Because no one who looked at this property was planning to stay in it. The last meeting happened at the shop itself. Kyle Thorne and Derek Voss arrived with their own solicitor. Ingrid came with her file folder. Ruth stood leaning against the back workbench, arms folded, and said nothing. Ingrid laid the documents down on the bench one at a time, with the methodical patience of someone who has already arranged the outcome and is only now showing it to the room. The certified mail receipts, Kyle Thorne's signature on the return card, the redemption period record, the Heritage Fund eligibility letter. "You're welcome to file," she said pleasantly. "But your client was notified 3 times and signed for the final notice. A judge will dismiss this in 1 hearing, and your client will be paying costs." Voss studied the documents. He was a sharp man. He saw what they said. But Kyle Thorne couldn't let it go. "This place should have stayed in the family," he said. His voice had gone tight. "That old woman had no right to let it fall to a stranger. It's worth something now. A stranger walks in with $35 and takes it." Ruth went to the shelf and brought the ledger to the bench. She opened it to the back, to the pages of Given, written in his great-aunt's hand across 36 years. "Your great-aunt didn't owe you anything," Ruth said. Her voice was even. She spent her whole life giving things quietly to the people around her and never once saying so. She turned a page. The Korhonen children's winter coats, Given. Stan Birch's coat lining so he'd be warm, Given. A young woman's wedding dress fabric, Given. She closed the ledger. "She died here alone, Mr. Thorne. You didn't come. Now you're here because it's worth money." She looked at him. She was afraid of exactly that. She wrote about it in the letter she left. She did not hand him the letter. She did not need to. The room went quiet. Wind moved through the poplars outside. Kyle Thorne looked at the ledger on the bench, and then looked at the wall, and then looked at the floor, and what passed across his face was not anger. It was something smaller and harder to carry. The expression of a man realizing he had been wrong about the worth of something his whole life, and that the realization had come too late to do anything about it. "Voss to draw," he said flatly. They left, and this time the dust behind the SUV didn't come back. The Heritage Fund came through in early spring. A contractor assessed the building, confirmed what Frank had said from the beginning. The bones were good, and the work proceeded through April and May. Floor reinforced, eaves rebuilt, electrical brought up to code. The thing that had kept everyone away from this property for 15 years turned out to need only the right person, willing to stay long enough to file 1 form. Ruth opened Thorne's notions properly on a Saturday in July. A table out front with bolts of fabric. A handwritten sign in the window. Alterations, custom work, come in. Bet Arsenault brought cornbread. Helen Mackay drove out from Renfrew with a framed print sheet had made of the shop's original 1952 business license, recovered from the county archive. "For the wall," she said, "so people know this place has been here a long time." Ruth hung it beside the painted sign above the door. She kept writing in the new ledger. A coat lining for a woman who counted out coins at the counter and came up short. Ruth took what was there and wrote, "Given." A family passing through with a blown tire and 3 kids in the back seat, and not enough in the wallet for both the repair and the gas to get where they were going. She sorted out the tire, gave them what she could from the cash box, and wrote, "Given. They have a long way to go." She put a basket near the door, rotating fabric remnants, thread, needles, buttons, set out fresh on Mondays and usually gone by Friday. A card on the basket read, "Take what you need, leave what you can." People left things. Sometimes fabric, sometimes a note. A long-haul driver came in once with a torn jacket lining. Ruth fixed it in 20 minutes, charged him for the thread. He left $50 in the basket on his way out. "Someone did something like this for my grandmother once," he said. "Long time ago." Ruth pointed up at the sign above the door. He read it and nodded the way people nod when something reaches them exactly where they are. On a Sunday afternoon in late October, almost exactly 1 year from the day she'd first driven into this valley, Ruth sat on the porch of Thorne's notions, in a coat she'd sewn herself from the red wool in the cedar chest. The hills were the color of embers going cool. The creek ran somewhere in the tree line. The valley smelled of wood smoke and the particular cold that comes before the first snow. She had Edna's ledger on her lap, her own new one beside it. Edna's ran 36 years, Ruth's was 40 pages in. She held the thimble, Elsa's thimble, worn smooth at the cap from her grandmother's decades of use beginning to wear again from hers. She turned it and looked at the initials, E.H. A month earlier, going through a box of old papers in the back room, invoices and receipts from the 1970s, she had found a letter. A letter from a Finnish woman in Sudbury who had been a regular mail-order customer at Thorne's Notions for years, ordering fine thread unavailable up north. The letter was signed, Ruth Halvorsen, Sudbury, Ontario. Ruth had read it 3 times. Then she had sat down on the stool and laughed, not from surprise exactly, but from the feeling of something very old and carefully arranged finally clicking into place. Her grandmother and Edna Thorne had never stood in the same room, but they had written to each other for years, 2 women on opposite ends of a postal route, who had held the same belief about the same work without ever comparing notes. The thimble had been Elsa's. Its initials had led Ruth here. The shop had been waiting for someone who would understand the ledger, who would read the word given without needing it explained. Some things are arranged over a very long time by people who never meet, who trust that the right person will eventually arrive. They leave what they can in the places they love, and they trust those places to hold it. Ruth pressed the thimble into her palm, cool, smooth, worn to the exact shape of patient use, and looked at the sign above the door in the last light. Every stitch holds someone together. She had repainted it in August, following Edna's strokes. It stood out now against the grayed wood, visible from the road. She had watched people slow down to read it. Some debts are not money. They are the promises ordinary people make in ordinary places, quietly, without announcement. The coat lining that keeps a man warm through a bad winter. The dress fabric that lets a child walk into a schoolyard with her head up. The needle threaded for the one whose hands are shaking too hard to do it alone. These promises do not end when the person who made them is gone. They pass forward. They find the next pair of hands. They wait, patient as cedar, until the right person lifts the lid. Ruth Halvorsen was 52 years old, nearly broke with nowhere to go. She paid $35 for a closed shop at the end of a gravel road in a valley of 17 people. It was the truest investment she ever made. If this story reached you tonight, please share it with someone who needs it, and tell us in the comments, has a stranger ever left something behind that found its way to you? We'd love to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.